Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Gentle rides are a great addition to any theme park as they look really nice and are great for people that haven't built up the courage to go on the more intense rides yet. This does come at the cost of them not being particularly great at making money, attracting guests or really anything else. Except for one ride. One gentle ride type is incredibly overpowered and one of the best ride types in the entire game. The maze. Now, you might be looking at this maze and think, what on earth is so overpowered about this ride? The guests take forever to find the exit, you can't charge very much for it, and it's way too boring for most guests. And you're absolutely right, this maze is not good at all. However, there is one maze design that is much better, and it is this tiny one tile maze, or as I like to call it for reasons you will find out later, the death maze. So, what is so great about this maze? Well, let's start with its size and cost. With the size of just 3 tiles, including the entrance and exit buildings, it is the smallest ride possible. And rather unsurprisingly, it is also the cheapest ride possible in the game at just €27. This low cost and small size means it's the most efficient ride in the game for a whole load of different things. A very important number in the game is your soft guest cap. This is the total amount of guests that your rides and stalls will attract to the park, and if you have more guests in the park than that number, new guests will spawn 4 times slower. Every ride and stall attracts a different number of guests. Roller coasters usually attract a lot, with most big coaster types having a value between 75 and 120. Flat rides attract significantly less, usually between 30 and 50. The maze is right in the middle of this with 40. A while ago I made a video on how amazingly efficient this micro corkscrew design is, and one of the reasons was that it attracts 100 guests to your park for a price of just €349. This is indeed very efficient, as this is 28.7 guests per €100. Despite this being among the very best in the game, the maze still easily has it beat, as it attracts 40 guests for a price of just €27, which translates to 148 guests per €100, making it over 5 times as efficient as the micro corkscrew coaster. It's also better in terms of space efficiency in almost all cases. A death maze attracts 13.3 guests per tile used, and a micro corkscrew attracts slightly less with 12.5 guests per tile. However, if you build more than one, you can overlap them a bit, in which case they only occupy 6 tiles each instead of 8. Now, it is slightly more space efficient than the maze, with 16.7 guests attracted per tile used. However, if you want to get any kind of decent throughput on it, you will need to add a queue line, in which case the maze will be more efficient again, as it does not need a queue line. A few coaster types can be built more space efficiently than the maze, such as this looping coaster design with an impressive 19 guests per tile, but as soon as you want decent stats and want the guests to actually ride, the maze is the most space efficient ride in the game to increase your soft guest cap. But what about the functioning of the ride itself? Surely with its low stats you can't charge much for it and thus it can barely make any profit? Well, you may be surprised about that, but first we have to consider that this only matters if you charge for the rides. If you charge for the park entrance, then guests don't pay anything for the rides anyway. There are still on-ride photos, which the maze obviously cannot sell, so this is a downside, but other than that, there is no difference here. This downside does get worse when you charge for the ride though. Here I have 2 micro corkscrew coasters, and together they manage to make about €5,000 a month on average. This is really quite good and will be hard to beat. In the same space we can fit 8 mazes, which together only make a measly €14,000? Yes, despite the much lower maximum ticket price, these mazes can make nearly triple the profit of the corkscrew coasters. This is because their maximum throughput is insanely high. The corkscrew tops out at somewhere between 2500 and 2600 guests per hour, which is very good for how cheap and small it is. A vertical drop coaster with an endless supply of trains more than doubles that with nearly 6000 guests per hour, which is the highest throughput of any single stationed ride. Except for the maze. A maze with a maximum capacity of 16 guests, which is the limit in RCT2 Vanilla, can reach a massive 8500 guests per hour. So, whereas the pair of two corkscrew coasters reach a combined throughput of about 5100 an hour, the 8 mazes do about 69,000 guests an hour. This throughput difference of a factor 13 easily offsets the 5 times lower ticket price that the maze has. Okay, but this isn't realistic at all. You need way more guests in the park to keep up this 69,000 guests per hour, and the intensity rating of the maze is way lower, leading to many more guests not willing to ride it because it's too boring. Let's do a test in a real park now to see how well the maze holds up. I will build 1 micro corkscrew and 4 death mazes next to each other in a normal park that I built a few years ago. This test will show how profitable the maze still is when you don't have 50 guests per tile waiting to ride it. After a few months I looked at the profits and these are the results. The corkscrew coaster made about 8,000 euros and the mazes combined only made a little over 3,000 euros. This shows that the previous laboratory test was inflating how good the maze is quite a lot. It is still quite decent, but since the corkscrew coaster gets a lot more profit per guest and has an intensity rating that's a much more common preference, it beats the maze in parks where you have fewer guests. And this park is still fairly crowded. In a more quiet park, the maze would perform even worse. So, to make the most profit, the maze isn't the best ride, unless you have a super crowded park and the guests prefer gentle rides option is enabled. Profitability and how many guests a ride attracts are the two main indicators of how good a ride is, but the death maze can do a bunch of other things that make it super useful, including the thing that gives it its ominous name. The first thing is storing guests. Sometimes you have a need to store a bunch of guests somewhere off the main paths. This is mostly useful to battle overcrowding in pay for entry scenarios, as guests aren't spending much after they've entered the park anyway. You can use queue lines for this, as guests will never become unhappy if you put a TV on every tile. In order for the guests to actually be trapped when they're in a queue line, the ride will need to have a super low throughput or even not go at all, like this synchronized coaster that has no other train to synchronize with, so it never goes. The one tile maze is absolutely perfect for this. If you don't make the entire square open, but instead leave a line in the middle, it becomes unsolvable. Now limit the capacity to just one guest and you have a perfect guest trap. You will have one very unhappy guest walking back and forth in the maze forever, but that is more than worth the super easy and cheap queue line trap. If you have been watching my channel a lot lately, you probably already know about the second useful thing, which is the maze trap. This is when you build a maze with at least one food stall and maybe some other stalls on the exit path tile and nothing else. Any guest that rides the maze will stay happy on that single tile forever, as long as they can afford to purchase food. You can actually do this with any ride type, but the maze is again very useful here because it is so tiny and cheap and has a very high throughput, making it the best option in a variety of challenges and optimized runs. It is also one of the few rides in the game that cannot break down, meaning you don't need a mechanic to fix it. And this leads perfectly into the final trick that the maze can do, which is the one that gives it the name Death Maze. Sometimes, usually in pay for entry scenarios, you want to get rid of the guests as quickly as possible after they enter the park. This is to make place for new guests, who can give up nearly all of their money for the park entry fee once more. A well-known strategy for this is closing all your rides and the park to get a lot of guests out and then reopening everything again. This works, but it is quite cumbersome and takes a while to do. Wouldn't it be nice if this just happened passively in the background? Introducing the Void Maze for all your guest deletion needs. Simply build a maze where the exit leads to an underground area that does not have any path. Whenever a guest has ridden this maze, they exit underground, fall into the void and disappear. You no longer need to perform a mass exodus every now and then, as guests will consistently ride the maze and become one with the darkness to make space for a new guest. You may think this will destroy your park rating as you are killing a lot of guests, but the game does not see this as killing. Instead, it treats it the same as if the guest just exited your park via the park entrance. It really is the ideal way to perform mass murder. Cheap, passively in the background, no mess left behind, and without any of the bad reviews. But why is the maze in particular so great for this? Can't you do this with any ride type? You indeed can, but as mentioned before, the maze is one of the few rides in the game that cannot break down. A void ride by default does not have an exit path, and mechanics enter through the exit when fixing a ride, so a ride with a void exit cannot be fixed if it breaks down. This makes all rides that can break down, which is the vast majority, not ideal for this. The only ones that don't break down are the lift, mini golf, crooked house, boat hire and of course the maze. Of these, the maze is the smallest, cheapest and has the highest throughput, making it by far the best void ride. And that is why I call this tiny maze the Death Maze, and that is also why this maze is so incredibly good. It attracts guests the most efficiently out of any ride type, it can be incredibly profitable in a select few circumstances, and it is super useful for a variety of other tricks. If you enjoyed this video, you may also enjoy this one, that is all about how the maze trap works and what it can do. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.